Welcome back, everyone. You sent us an audio episode on Japanese American history, and wow, there's so much to unpack here.
It's a dense one.
Yeah, it really is. So we're going to do a deep dive and try to really explore it, starting from when they first arrived, as laborers in like the late 1800s,
Right.
all the way through their internment during World War II, and then the decades-long fight for redress, right?
It's a powerful story, and I don't think a lot of people really appreciate it,
No, not
the
like.
full scope of it.
And just to give you one fascinating example, did you know that Japanese Americans really built the agricultural landscape of California?
Yeah.
But they were barred from owning the very land that they farmed.
It is, it's a real paradox.
Yeah.
It really shows the complexity of the immigrant experience in America. I mean, they were both welcomed and feared,
Yeah.
needed, yet rejected.
And it seems like it all started with this demand for cheap labor in the late 19th century, right?
Mm-hmm.
America was industrializing like crazy.
For workers,
Needed work.
for railroads, for plantations, for all these massive projects, right?
Exactly. Just like, before them you had Chinese laborers that were recruited.
Right.
Japanese immigrants were coming to Hawaii
Right.
in the 1850s to work on those big sugar and coffee plantations.
Yeah, and the episode even mentions an 1899 labor contract, right?
Interesting.
Where part of the workers' wages was held back to pay for a return trip back to Japan.
Oh, wow.
So it seems like both sides, like the Japanese immigrants and the American employers, they both thought this whole thing was temporary.
Yeah. And that's where things get really interesting because despite that initial idea of returning, a lot of these immigrants stayed, built communities and just made America home.
Yeah, it's interesting. By 1900, there were already 24,000 Japanese in the U.S., but only 400 were women.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
You can see how that early immigration was mainly driven by labor needs.
yeah.
But then as families joined those men, you started to see these vibrant Japanese American communities really taking root. They established Buddhist temples.
Yep.
They had Christian churches,
Mm-hmm.
businesses. I mean, they had a big impact, especially on the agricultural sector
Oh, absolutely.
of the American economy,
Yeah, I mean, by 1940, Japanese American farms were producing a third of California's truck crops.
I have to admit, when I heard truck crops, I wasn't exactly sure what that meant.
Right, so truck crops are basically fruits and vegetables that are grown specifically for the market.
Okay.
So think tomatoes, lettuce, strawberries. And the fact that Japanese Americans were so dominant in this sector, it really shows their skill and work ethic. But their success, unfortunately, led to a backlash.
Oh, yeah.
And white laborers started fearing competition for jobs and resources, so they started advocating for restrictions on Japanese immigration.
It's so reminiscent of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It seems like xenophobia just keeps popping up over and over again in American history.
Sadly, you're right. It's a recurring problem. And this particular wave of, anti-Japanese sentiment, it led to the 1907 Gentleman's Agreement between the U.S. and Japan. And this restricted new labor immigration, but allowed family members to join those already here.
So more women, more children started arriving.
Exactly. And the community grew even more, but they continued to face obstacles even with families together.
What kinds of obstacles?
Well, one of the biggest ones was the alien land laws, first put in place in 1913.
Right.
And then further restricted in the 1920s. And these laws specifically barred, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship, end quote, from owning land.
Which was obviously aimed at the Japanese.
Oh, absolutely. It was a direct attempt to kind of limit their progress and keep them economically vulnerable.
So you've got these people who are working hard, contributing so much to the economy, but they can't even own the land that they're farming.
A classic example, really, of the hypocrisy they faced.
The episode also talks about the Nisei, the first generation born in the U.S., and the challenges they had being kind of caught between two worlds.
Right.
Like they're encouraged to be American, but also hold on to their Japanese heritage.
Exactly. It was this constant push and pull. A lot of Nisei went to Japanese language schools to keep those cultural ties.
Yes.
But they were also navigating the American education system.
Right. So it created this generational gap, I guess, with their Issei parents who were, probably more traditional in their outlook.
Absolutely. And all of this was happening against a backdrop of just increasing hostility and discrimination. And then things really came to a head in 1924, right?
Yeah, the 1924 Immigration Act.
Yeah.
That completely stopped Japanese immigration.
Until 1952, it was a total halt. And that act, it was fueled by these nativist sentiments, supported by groups like the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
It was a really dark turn.
Yeah.
Yet again, showing those recurring themes of fear and exclusion based on race and origin.
So by the 1930s, you have a huge population of Japanese Americans who are second generation, right?
Yeah.
They're deeply rooted in American society, businesses, farms, communities. And then World War II breaks out.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it just unleashed this wave of paranoia and fear that had been building for years.
Yeah. And the episode really emphasizes that this wasn't just, a sudden reaction to Pearl Harbor. It was really the culmination of decades of anti-Japanese sentiment and discriminatory policies.
It had been brewing for a long time. And remember those LA County Farm Survey records we talked about? Those were like pre-Pearl Harbor surveillance.
Wow.
Focused on Japanese Americans, specifically farmers, which shows how deep that suspicion ran even before the war.
Yeah. And then in February 1942, President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066.
Right, which allowed for the exclusion of anyone considered a threat from the West Coast, a very broad order that was swiftly and unjustly applied to Japanese Americans.
Yeah. And they had no due process.
No.
Because they weren't citizens, right?
The fact that they were denied citizenship really came back to bite them. It left them with zero legal recourse.
It's crazy how quickly things escalated from there.
Yeah, the episode talks about curfews, travel bans, forced registration of families, and then finally the removal to assembly centers. It must have been terrifying.
It must have been. And by March of 42, that forced relocation was in full swing. The episode mentions these instructions from General John L. DeWitt on March 2nd, where he ordered the removal of all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast.
Wow.
Based solely on, their ethnicity and their location.
It's really disturbing when you compare it to the lack of action against German Americans or Italian Americans. I mean, it exposes the blatant racism at play.
It makes you think, what does it say about a country when fear and prejudice can just trample basic principles of justice and equality like that?
It's a question that's worth pondering and something that, we'll continue to explore as we look into the internment experience itself in part 2.
Definitely. So these assembly centers, they weren't just temporary, right?
No, not at all. I mean, they were officially called relocation centers.
Right.
And these were designed to basically isolate and control Japanese Americans for the long haul. The episode really paints a bleak picture of life inside. They had these cramped barracks, constant surveillance from those guard towers, barbed wire fences everywhere. It's hard to imagine the psychological toll that takes on people, especially when they've done nothing wrong.
Right, to be ripped from your life on the West Coast and then placed in these harsh, unfamiliar environments, right? The episode mentioned Topaz in Utah, Minidoka in Idaho, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, even Hart Mountain in Wyoming.
Yeah, and a lot of these families, they came from these temperate climates on the West Coast, and then they're suddenly thrust into these really difficult places. But it's amazing how, despite all that, they tried to create some sense of normalcy within the camp. They set up schools for their kids, they organized cultural events, even had sports leagues. It really shows their resilience and their community spirit.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear about their efforts to kind of maintain hope and dignity amidst all this injustice.
Absolutely.
But we can't forget that this was still imprisonment.
Right.
A fundamental violation of their rights. And then, to make things even more complex, you have these young Nisei men being asked to prove their loyalty by serving in the military while their families are still locked up. It's
a really complicated and, frankly, heartbreaking situation. The episode talks about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, formed in 1943, made up almost entirely of Japanese Americans.
And they became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history.
Right.
Over 18,000 decorations, a Congressional Medal of Honor. I mean, their bravery is undeniable.
Absolutely.
But it just highlights the absurdity of their situation, fighting for a country that imprisoned their families.
It really shows this impossible choice that Japanese Americans faced during the war.
Yeah.
You have the 442nd risking their lives to prove their loyalty. And on the other hand, you have the story of the Hart Mountain Fair Play Committee.
That's a story I hadn't heard before.
Yeah.
It really changes how I think about this whole idea of loyalty and dissent, especially during wartime.
It's an important part of the story, even though it doesn't get as much attention. These were 63 young men who refused to be drafted until their families were released.
Yeah, they said, we're willing to fight for our country, but not while our basic rights are being denied.
Exactly. And they ended up facing imprisonment twice.
Wow.
First in the camps, and then again for their principled stand. And their sentences for refusing the draft were actually longer than the time their family spent in the camps.
So it's like adding insult to injury.
It really is. And it makes you think about what true patriotism really means. When is it right to stand up to your own government, even when it's dangerous?
Yeah, their actions really show us that sometimes being patriotic means challenging your government when you believe it's in the wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a powerful lesson. And it's sad to think that even after the war, it took decades for Japanese Americans to receive any real recognition for what they went through.
And the road to redress, it was long and difficult.
It really was. The episode talks about how, at the end of the war, the U.S. government actually wanted to disperse Japanese Americans across the country and prevent them from going back to the West Coast.
Wow.
Yeah, but by 1945, there were still so many people in the camps, something like 70,000, that they had to abandon that plan and let people return to their homes.
I'm sure that was a relief, but I can't imagine it was a happy ending,
No, not at all. They came back to a society that was still prejudiced.
Right.
They'd lost their homes, businesses, livelihoods, everything. The episode mentions $400 million in property losses alone.
Yeah.
Imagine having to rebuild your life after that kind of trauma, facing discrimination still in housing and jobs, and carrying that emotional burden of unjust imprisonment.
It's unimaginable. But it's amazing, despite all that, Japanese Americans showed such strength and determination, not just rebuilding their lives, but eventually fighting for recognition and justice.
Yeah, their resilience is truly inspiring. And even basic rights like citizenship, they had to fight for that. The 1952 Walter McCarran Act finally gave Japanese immigrants the right to become naturalized citizens.
Okay.
But even that, it was more about Cold War politics and shifting relationships between the U.S. and Japan, not really about acknowledging the wrongs of the past.
So getting more political power and influence within the system, that was still a ways off.
Yeah, but that Walter McCarran Act did kind of open the door for people like Senator Daniel Inouye, who was a World War II veteran and became the first Japanese American elected to Congress in the 1950s.
This is a huge step. But the episode really credits the Sansei generation, the ones born after the war, with really pushing for redress.
Oh, absolutely. Inspired by the social movements of the 60s, they started to question why everyone was so silent about the internment. They challenged their parents, their grandparents to talk about what happened, and they demanded that the injustice be acknowledged.
It's like each generation kind of builds on the struggles of those who came before. Right?
Yeah, they amplify those voices and demand change. And that's what happened in 1980 when President Carter established the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, the CWRIC.
Right.
And this commission held hearings all over the country, giving former internees a chance to share their stories publicly for the first time.
Those must have been powerful testimonies.
They were. They really helped to change public opinion and eventually led to a formal apology from the U.S. government.
Which, of course, paved the way for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988.
Signed by President Reagan.
Yeah, offering a formal apology and $20,000 in reparations to each surviving internee.
It was a landmark moment, but as the episode points out, $20,000, while significant, could never really make up for what Japanese Americans went through.
Right.
And the fact that it was only offered to those still alive in '88, it kind of feels like the government trying to limit its accountability.
It makes you think about what true justice means, Can any amount of money ever heal the wounds of that kind of betrayal?
Yeah.
This has been a really heavy discussion so far. It's amazing how much we've learned from just this one audio episode.
Yeah, there's a lot packed in there.
But what really gets me is how relevant this whole story feels today,
Oh, for sure.
Like the fear, the prejudice, the way civil liberties can be eroded.
Yeah.
It's like we're looking in a mirror reflecting our own times.
That's exactly what makes this deep dive so important, right? It's not just some event in the past.
Right.
It's about understanding how fragile our rights are and how easily things can go wrong.
It's kind of scary how easily those in power can exploit fear and prejudice to get what they want,
Yeah, it can happen really fast.
And the rhetoric they used back then to justify interning Japanese Americans, like talking about the other and blaming whole communities based on their ethnicity.
Yeah.
We hear the same stuff today, about immigration, national
Mhm.
security, even how certain religious groups are treated.
It's a reminder that the lessons of history, they're easy to forget.
Yeah.
We have to be really careful, challenge those who use fear and prejudice, and protect the rights of everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from.
And the Civil Liberties Act, that was a big step, but it can't be the end of the story, right?
No, definitely not.
The episode talked about how the Sansei generation, the one born after the war, really pushed for redress,
Right.
which makes me think, what about the generations after them? What role will they have in keeping this story alive?
It's up to all of us to make sure we don't forget what happened.
Yeah.
We have to keep telling these stories and fighting for justice and equality.
The episode ended by saying that Japanese-American internment is a reminder to always be on guard against prejudice and xenophobia. Yeah, a powerful message.
It really got me thinking, where are we seeing these same kinds of problems today? In my community, in the country.
That's the question I hope listeners will take away with them. We can't just learn about history. We have to apply it to what's happening now and use it to make things better.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the very beginnings of Japanese immigration to the fight for redress that went on for decades.
It's quite a journey.
I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this really complex part of American history.
It's a story of resilience, of courage, of people overcoming incredible odds.
Yeah, and it's also a warning, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We have to make sure we never let fear and prejudice win out over justice and equality.
We can't afford to go back there.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you'll keep exploring this story and think about what it means for you and the world around you.